I finally did it. I managed to level another character in Path of Exile 2, in this case, a Poison Pathfinder. And so, in today's video, I'm going to break down how I did it. This is going to be a two-part sort of deal. The first part being when I played Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod into Explosive Gas Arrow. This is something that I did in more or less a solo self-found environment. I had a little bit of gold on my character, but I didn't exactly make exorbitant purchases, so I probably would have had enough just from picking stuff off the ground and selling it to the vendor. And then, the second half of the video, where, from Act 3 on, I played Poisonous Concoction. And this is the sort of thing that you can't really do at the start of a league, or at the very least you can't do as early as I did, since as it turns out, Poisonous Concoction is pretty rough without some items. So, with all that said, if any of that sounds interesting to you, or if you want to know what a more endgame version of Poisonous Concoction looks like, do be sure to get subscribed, maybe leave a like while you're down there, and for now, let's get into things, starting with my Act 1 journey. Now, from the very start, I had a pretty easy time with Lightning Arrow and Lightning Rod. I'd use Lightning Arrow to shoot various packs of monsters, then I would drop Lightning Rod with Scatter Shot so it has additional projectiles for the Lightning Arrow to chain to, and use that for single target, such as on a boss, at least on a boss that doesn't move away, because some of the bosses were a bit uncooperative. And overall, this felt pretty good. I have to say, I think Sorc felt a little bit better from what I remember, but also between Sorc, Ranger, and Warrior, I haven't had a character that really felt bad in Act 1, at least so far. However, there is one interesting thing that I did come across. At the very start of Act 1, things went really well. Towards the midpoint, I hadn't upgraded my weapon at all. I was still using my very first bow from the beach, because everything had gone really well. And I did notice my damage start to lag around the Cemetery of the Turtles. So, wait a minute, I can fix this, jump back to town, bought a new bow, all of my damage problems were solved. And this is something that I remember to do throughout the rest of my run, or at the very least until I swap to Poisonous Concoction where the bow doesn't quite apply. So, if you are playing a bow character, or in general any attack build, and you find your damage falling off or you're struggling a bit, consider checking the vendor and seeing if there's a weapon upgrade there. Also, if you have an endgame loot filter, maybe swap it out so you don't hide all of your loot in the early game. So a couple upgrades later, I was shocking my way through Geonoise Manor and turning the Lord himself into a pincushion. Overall, this went really, really well, though I did notice that my character was quite squishy. Admittedly, I don't think the Ranger in Act 1 is any squishier than any other character, but if you're going from a 9-ish thousand energy shield, like 5 to 6,000 mana character, to a low-level character, yeah, you're going to feel notably squishy. That's just the vast difference between the end game in Path of Exile 2 and the early game in Path of Exile 2. But after sitting in the fire a little bit, redoing the fight once, I did manage to get him down, and I have to say, the DPS felt pretty darn consistent. He didn't die instantly, but I also didn't feel like I was struggling. And if you're curious, this is a little clip of what I was doing in Act 1. For most of Act 1, I was just Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod. But, about the midpoint, I got Freezing Salvo, which is an excellent way to have another button to hit, especially if you add Hourglass support for 40% more damage. It takes time to build up the projectiles anyway, so you might as well add the cooldown and add the big damage. In terms of gear, I was pretty much just using trash from the floor, though I did get pretty lucky and I found a bow with 2 sockets. I don't think you can count on that every time. I found a couple runes to put into it, some decent gear that had a little bit of life, a little bit of resistances, and a Meganord's Girdle, which was really nice at this level, though later would definitely be something I wanted to swap off of, as I suspect increasing flask charges used is not exactly what you want if you're playing Poisonous Concoction. But with all that out of the way, I took the boss down and proceeded into Act 2. Now at this point, my damage did start to feel a little bit less consistent. Enemies were scaling, and while Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod still felt pretty good, I was definitely getting to the point where I was going to have to upgrade my gear sooner rather than later. As a note, this is also where having the Freezing Salvo was really, really good, because I could start using it on trash and rare monsters, especially those that are lightning resistant, to make sure I had a little bit of extra damage and didn't spend quite so much time running away from enemies and kiting backwards, even if, let's be honest, I probably would have leveled much faster if I spent that time kiting and running backwards rather than fighting all the enemies and trying to get better drops. And so, at level 22, I was excited to change things up and try Gas Arrow, because I've heard really good things about Gas Arrow, and then doing something to ignite enemies, usually Flame Roll, to cause it to explode. I don't know if it was super optimal or not, but I was running Scattershot on the Gas Arrow, with my logic being, if all 3 explosions can shotgun, which they should be able to, then firing 3 arrows is more damage than firing 1 arrow, even with the damage penalty and attack speed penalty. I had a pretty low-level Flame Wall, and I also had a Herald of Ash that I was able to pick up because I had a couple extra gems from my earlier levels. All this meant that I was fully prepared to play Explosive Gas Arrow. So I immediately put it to test, and yeah, it's really good. Even with my bad unupgraded bow, it was only taking a few shots to explode enemies now. Plus, after you ignited an enemy, all of a sudden, they would keep burning, so any future shots would continue to explode, and even get some chip damage from the poison. You can pre-stack poison clouds and detonate them later. Overall, it is a super powerful and very fun playstyle. So, I absolutely tore through the Mastodon Badlands, and the next few zones in Act 2. Admittedly, I don't think my DPS is as impressive as it could be here, but that's mostly because everything was going well enough that I, as I tend to while leveling, got lazy and didn't properly upgrade my gear. If I had been checking the vendor, which, yes, I told you to do that earlier, and no, this is not the last time that I will say something is a good idea and then forget to do it myself, then I suspect I would have been killing things even faster, because right after a weapon upgrade, I'd be like 3-shotting rares. And then if I was using the same weapon 5 or even 10 levels later, it would take a lot more shots, because as it turns out, it's not so good to not change your gear for 10 levels. But I also kind of suspect you didn't click on this video for me to say, hey, Explosive Gas Arrow, one of the best leveling setups for any character, is good. You probably already know that, and if you didn't, congratulations, you now know a really consistent way to level pretty much any build. So instead, I'm going to talk about when things get interesting. That is in Act 3. I decided, okay, Explosive Gas Arrow, yeah, it's really good, but this is not going to be an Explosive Gas Arrow character. In fact, if I wanted to play Explosive Gas Arrow, I would have been Deadeye rather than Pathfinder. So instead, I want to go Poisonous Concoction, and I decided to fully respec, grab a bunch of poison nodes, and try it out on, of course, the best possible character, Mechtel. Why did I think it was a good idea to try out Poisonous Concoction on Mechtel the Forge Master? I have no idea. But, spoiler alert, it was not a good idea. Not because Poisonous Concoction doesn't do damage, but because Poisonous Concoction costs Mana Flask charges. And if you don't have any gear to generate Mana Flask charges, or you have very little gear that allows you to generate Mana Flask charges, you are very likely to run out of Mana Flask charges before the boss runs out of health. And then you have to wait a very long time before you can actually do damage again. For my first couple attempts on Mechtel, this was made worse by the fact that I forgot to take off a Meganords. Yeah, don't do that. But even after taking off a Meganords, I was still unable to kill the boss before I ran out of flask charges, and after I ran out of flask charges, I'd have to slowly dance around and hope I didn't get hit too many times, before inevitably I would get hit too many times, and I would die. After doing this a few times, I said, okay, I could push through and be like, hey look, I, in SSF on a League Start budget, leveled up the character. Or I could actually play the game and have fun. So I took a little bit of a break to buy some items, including some stuff that would help me restore my mana more consistently. And then I killed Mechtel. And then I got back to blasting. Because if you have enough damage and enough flask charged in from your gear, Poisonous Concoction is really, really fun. Most of the time when clearing trash, all I'd really need to do is toss Poisonous Concoction on a pack once. It would kill most of the monsters, and my Plague Bearer would then go off and kill the rest. Sometimes for a tankier rare, I'd cast it a couple times, stack stuff up, then hit Plague Bearer for good measure. And because I had spent some time to buy some extra gear, I of course got myself a Proj Quiver, a Widow Hail, a Gold Rim, a Ghost Drive, all that fun leveling stuff that makes the experience much faster and much smoother. So, at that point, I absolutely blasted through the rest of Act 3. Doryani was no problem at all. I blasted through Act 1 Cruel, Act 2 Cruel, and Act 3 Cruel, all without issues. The only thing that came even close to an issue were boss fights, where sometimes my flask charges did get really low. This was probably my own fault, because at this point I was using martial tempo. That gives 25% more attack speed, which means you consume the flask charges faster. But here's the thing. It also makes the skill feel much more fluid, and when I was clearing trash, having the extra attack speed was just good, and I was too lazy to gem swap, even though I probably should have. So, that is how I leveled my character. And of course, with all the extra gear, it was super smooth from the Act 3 point on. Now, I just beat Doryani in Act 3 Cruel. I'd like to take a minute to go over my passive tree, my gems, and my gear. Do not take this as a build guide. Do not take this as the most optimal way to do things. This is just what I did. So, with that said, let's get into it. First up, Pathfinder Ascendancy. The first thing you have to take if you want to play Poisonous Concoction is Poisonous Concoction. After that, you have a couple options. The one that I went for was Contagious Contamination, because it allows me to be lazy. Realistically, you can't go wrong with running Assault, less of a move speed penalty for using skills while you move. And you also can't go wrong with Traveler's Wisdom, which grants 5 passive skill points. Now, if you are struggling for flask charges, instead, go with Connected Chemistry, because this is 50% more flask charges gained. For a little bit, this was the difference between me sustaining and me not sustaining, but later I realized I could just get a bunch of nodes on the tree and that problem would just solve itself, so I opted for the Poison Prolif for lazier gameplay. Then in terms of passives, first up, I took Arcane Alchemy. This is mana flasks gain 0.1 charges per second. That gets scaled up later. Then I grabbed a whole bunch of flask gain mods, things like Lasting Concoctions. The flask effect duration doesn't really matter, not really using the mana flask very often, or the life flask for that matter, but what does very much matter is flask charges gained. Same thing for Cautious Concoctions, and this is really just for the movement speed. I also invested into a lot of poison nodes. Things like Stacking Toxins, Leeching Toxins, which felt really, really good for the recovery, and both Building Toxins and Escalating Toxins. It felt like taking the extra duration if you've inflicted a bunch of poisons helps to counteract the fact that a lot of things say reduced or less poison duration, but you can have more poisons on a target. Since I'm using Chaos skills, of course, Dark Entry, Projectile skills, so I took Kite Runner and Falcon Technique. I don't know how optimal Falcon Technique is, but hey, having more attack speed feels nice, so I used it. And last but not least, Master Fletching for even more bonuses from my quiver. So, next up, skills. For Poisonous Concoction, this is an AoE projectile chaos skill, hence the chaos skill level. It has kind of absurd levels of base damage. Like, the amount of base damage here is insane. Unfortunately, the crit rate kind of sucks and is really hard to increase. And also, it consumes 3 charges from your mana flask. Like I said, this is why mana flask sustain can be pretty rough. Then I added Scattershot, so now, instead of just throwing 1, I throw 3. Bursting Plague, the poison from supported skills add damage as Plague. This felt pretty good. To be honest with you, I wouldn't be too shocked if this was actually something that gets dropped moving into the end game. But for low levels, it seemed pretty nice. And then Martial Tempo for more attack speed, because that felt really good. Admittedly, something like Deadly Poison or Close Combat would be much better on boss fights. Yes, you will attack slower, but remember, once you poison cap, attacking faster kind of just drains your flasks faster anyway, so it is better to hit harder using one of these 2 skills. Then if you're wondering why I have the Gas Arrow and Toxic Growth, I was using those earlier. I didn't end up using them much later. Now down here, there's some interesting stuff. First up, Wind Dancer, which is a really nice defensive. Second up, Plague Bearer. This stores an expected amount of poison damage, and you release a big old Nova. You'll see me doing that a lot in the gameplay. It works really well. And if you're wondering how I'm getting a level 19 Plague Bearer, I cheated. And I am using this Prism of Belief. I do not recommend doing that because it's probably very expensive. At this point, I don't know. I bought this like 2 weeks ago because I thought I was going to level the character then. Turns out I'm leveling the character now. Yeah, it's pretty neat and it makes you clear much better. Then Alchemist's Boon. Unfortunately, this requires a pretty high level spirit gem. I believe it requires level 14 to cut. And this goes a long way by giving you 0.22 flask charges per second to fixing your flask charge sustain. Before this, I was heavily reliant on gear. After this, I think I could sustain even without my flask charge items. So, let's go into those items. First up, I'm using Widow Hail with a couple of Life on Kill soul cores. I just happen to have them lying around, so I tossed them in. And this Quiver. Physical damage to attacks gets converted over into poison. Accuracy means I'm just never missing, so I don't have to think about that as a mechanic. Attack speed's good, feels great. And +2 to level of all projectile skills, which isn't actually +2 because of a Widow Hail and because of increased effect from Quiver modifiers. As you can see, I go from 15 to 23, which is +8. So yes, as it turns out, this gives a lot of bonuses. That said, if you can't find or don't have a good Widow Hail, you can just get a +5 Proj skill bow instead. Just keep in mind that the Quiver and Widow Hail combo is better because other modifiers on your Quiver get magnified by Widow Hail. Whereas if you had 5 to 13 physical damage on your bow, that would apply to attacks made with the bow. Your Poisonous Concoction is not an attack with the bow. Therefore, it would not apply. But it applies on the Quiver, just like how increased attack speed also applies on the Quiver. How do I know this? Because my attack time, 0.48, now it's 0.66. Definitely applying. Same thing here. You can see the physical and the lightning damage. I don't have any lightning damage on my rings or my amulet, so the fact that it's here means the mods from a Quiver are applying. Then Gold Rim, it is purely there to cap resistances. It also looks kind of cool. Like 3D model-wise, my Ranger was looking pretty darn dandy. Minus the weird robe, but hey, can't win them all. Ghost Writhe, really good leveling item, helped to decap Chaos Res. Not sure I'm actually a fan of the life energy shield conversion stuff. That kind of made things harder because it lowered my stun threshold. But this one was corrupted with +15% to Chaos Res, so basically putting this one item on more or less caps Chaos Res. Felt super worth it to me. Snakebite, probably going to use this in the end game. Targets can be affected by +1 poison. Pathfinder stuff, you can actually make this into +2 once you get the double poison effect. Glowswarm, really good for Mana Flash sustain early on, +0.25 charges per second. And same thing for Keelhaul. Plus I grabbed the increased Life Flask recovery rate, because why not get a little bit more Life Flask healing? And then I decided to use an Instant Flask to maximize that bonus. Good job, me. And my ring, I purchased this for like 30-ish X. It has a lot of life, it has a lot of res, happen to have accuracy and phys attack damage. Probably going to be using this for a good bit as I level up. Sure-footed Sigil. Best leveling item in the game. Why is it the best leveling item? Because look at that beautiful dodge roll. For comparison, the dodge roll is almost twice as long with Sure-footed Sigil. If you use no other item that I've talked about today, please use Sure-footed Sigil. And then a pair of boots that I spent way too much money on because I wanted movement speed life boots. I don't recommend buying something like this. Last up, a life flask that I found, a charm that I found, and a mana flask that I found. I believe the increased charges gained is good, but the increased recovery rate, not doing anything because Poisonous Concoction doesn't cost mana, it just drains mana flask charges directly. You can see if I throw a few times, they go down, and then they come back pretty quickly because of all the flask recovery items. So, that's how I leveled my Pathfinder. One slight warning though, if you are playing in hardcore, do not do what I did, because despite my resistances being decent, my life was very low from wearing Ghost Writhe, and I had no physical damage mitigation. So, from time to time, I would get stunned, and then I would get killed. And that's not really a good way to play on hardcore. On softcore, it kinda didn't matter that much, because it wasn't a super frequent problem, and I did a lot of damage, so most things just died before they were able to actually hit me. So with that said, it's time for me to start experimenting with Poisonous Concoction in the endgame. Don't really have a super detailed plan here, just gonna try out the skill, learn as I go, and I'll probably have an update video at some point in the future. Again, this is not intended as a guide or a step-by-step thing for you to follow. This is just what I did and why I did it. Pretty sure it's not optimal, but hey, it got me to endgame, and overall the experience wasn't too bad. Though that said, I am curious, if you leveled a Pathfinder, what method did you use for leveling, and overall, did you think it felt good or did you think it felt bad? Just as a quick comparison, Pathfinder versus Sorc versus Warrior. In Act 1, all three felt pretty good. In Act 2, both the Sorc and the Warrior felt like they fell off in comparison to Act 1, and the Ranger just felt like she got stronger. In Act 3, Warrior fell off hard. In Act 3, the Sorc was cast on freeze, which at the time was disgustingly overpowered, so that felt super easy, way easier than this, even with the Twink gear. And if I count the Twink gear, yeah, this felt amazing, but that's probably cheating. And so I also don't really have too many thoughts on Cruel, because I never took the Warrior that far. The Sorc was, again, cast on freeze, and this character had full Twink gear. But hey, hopefully you found this interesting. Thanks for watching to the end. We'll see you in the next one.